Phil fails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life, such a mystery. Phil fails.
Welcome to Phil Fails. My name is Phillip Jones, and today we have returning guest Grant Potts. Wave to everybody, Grant. They live in the cameras. This is part of the Phil Fails at Philosophy series. We're now looking at and going to discuss the second big question of philosophy. What is knowledge? Maybe we should show the book again.
Yeah, just as a reminder, this is the book we're using, Philosophy's Big Questions, Comparing Buddhist and Western Approaches, and it's an edited volume by Stephen Emmanuel. So there are a series of questions it asks, and they invited philosophers who I think most of these folks are specialists in South Asian philosophy or Buddhist philosophy to write essays on these questions.
And the idea is that if you're a specialist in more Eastern philosophy, you're going to have a foundation of Western.
Yeah, if you're in a philosophy department, you're going to have that. Like it's
that's like the basis of
right.
everything.
I don't think there's a program in the United States where you could go, a philosophy program, and you could study on a graduate level philosophy in the Eastern tradition without also having a foundation in the Western tradition. Whereas the opposite is totally true. You can go study Western philosophy and have no, but that's just the provincialism of philosophy right now, and that's something I think people are actively trying to change. So.
Yeah, that's part of the kind of white centric or maybe Western centric. Well, we are in the West.
Yeah.
So they're like, hey, you need to know about us first. And then the add-on is knowing about other people once you have a foundation of us.
Yeah. And it's just the history of, academic traditions. They grew up in a Western context. So that's the framework they're operating from. And the work of deprovincializing that isn't something that happens overnight.
Yeah. Makes sense. That makes sense. There's a desire in me to make it provocative. I think
there's a desire to me to deprovocatize everything. Yeah. I love that term, deprovocatize.
Deprovocatize. Let's make it spicy, y'all.
Well, let's just chill it.
That's funny. Fire nice. Philosophy's fire nice. Phillip and Grant. That's funny. So I'll kick us off a little bit. This time I did things differently.
So
I approached reading differently.
Tell me about it.
I will. I'll tell you. So the first thing I did was I kept a list of the characters involving this chapter, and then I researched them separately.
Yeah, when you were messaging about it, I saw you were talking about looking up the folks, and I think that's totally. I do that too.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't do it as systematically as it sounds like you do, but and I talk to my students about this. Like, you have phones.
Yeah.
Right? You got to be careful you're not distracting yourself while you're reading. But if you're like, well, this Nagarjuna guy sounds interesting, go ahead and look him up, right?
Yeah, well, I did like a deep dive. Well, not kind of a deep dive where I'd spend a whole couple days watching this dispelling of disputes whole talk from a guy in Tibet or in Nepal that he was doing a whole talk on Nagarjuna and dispelling of disputes and that whole thing. And then I kind of did a little bit of the same thing with... So I'll just go through the names of the people, and then maybe you could add any thoughts you have on them and if I missed anybody. So we got Bertrand Russell, which is Western.
Right.
That's a Western name.
Yeah.
I could pronounce it easily.
Yeah, he's not Tibetan.
No, he's... and what I found of him was he was kind of a rich British guy.
Yeah.
A really affluent... Like he was... tied to the monarchy in some way, or at least to the upper class of Britain.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot that Russell has those kind of aristocratic connections.
It was, yeah. And I think as I read these, I think these are rich white people on the Western side.
Yeah, often. I think we also often fail to realize that, when we're looking at these Buddhist philosophers, they're also people coming out of privileged classes.
Really?
We just don't understand...
Yeah, the Buddha
as Westerners, as these, the social class system as well. So it's not as highlighted for us.
Right. But Siddhartha, the Buddha, he was royalty, right?
Right.
And he stepped away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, last time I taught Intro to Philosophy, I had a student who was very just like, dude, this looks like it's all just for like rich people.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a reality to that, right? kind of time and life support you need to engage in this kind of intellectual work requires resources, right? And that means that historically it is the province of wealthy classes, right? That is who gets to do philosophy. And that's true. I mean, you find exceptions, right? You find exceptions when you search through history of philosophers who came out of more modest backgrounds or even backgrounds of slavery. But they're often moving into privileged classes as they become philosophers. And that's true in ancient China, medieval China. That's true in South Asia. That's true in the Western context. And the reality is, it's a luxury.
Yeah,
on
to
some level.
contemplate
Right.
is time that you're not working the soil or cleaning someone's house or working in the industry or in a factory or whatever, or even selling insurance.
Right.
To contemplate is essentially to sit somewhere and think.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And I guess people can do that. You probably have philosophers that are in a more capitalistic endeavor that are sitting down and contemplating. It's kind of like the difference of artistic work for artistic sake or artistic work for capitalist sake. You know what I mean? Like I'm gonna make a video. Is it for a commercial or is it for an art house piece?
Right. Yeah.
Contemplation's required either way, right?
Right. And
people contemplate.
People contemplate. They have to have the time, and I mean, you need to have the time to do the labor of the contemplation. But you also have to have, in terms of who we study and we remember. Like there might be great philosophers just in terms of the thoughts they've had that we don't know about because they didn't write anything down, right?
So to be a writer,
right, and so
to be a part of a community,
to be a part of a community that has the resources, in an ancient context, to get you access to paper.
That's paper. I need paper.
Yeah.
I'm taken back to our original interview where we discussed, philosophy to know that you're doing it well. A part of that is getting consensus, checking the community of people that are also in that area. And that requires some level of marketing, however we want to look at it, getting your name out there, getting your ideas out there.
Right.
And that takes time and energy.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So Bertrand Russell.
British guy. What I got from him is he was he was in maths a bunch.
Yeah.
And it was analytical philosophy or logical philosophy, that sort of thing.
He's often seen as one of the real, for lack of a better word, founder of what we often talk about as the analytic tradition of philosophy, which dominates Anglo-American philosophy in the 20th century.
Yeah. And he's kind of a cool guy. Like he was divorced a couple times. He seemed like more of a radical. He wasn't your.
Yeah, I mean, he is. Part of what's interesting when you read Russell is that he sounds very like staid and British and proper, and yet what he's getting at is often very radical. And then, when you start exploring his life and his ideas, he's an outspoken atheist at a time when it's not popular to be so.
Didn't he go to the East for a while too?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
Maybe.
So I'll start, just as we explore Bertrand Russell, we start out this chapter, What is Knowledge, with a quote from Bertrand Russell, and I wrote it down here. I'll share it.
Yeah, go for it.
He said, "No definition can be satisfactory which introduces the word knowledge, both because this word is highly ambiguous and because every one of its possible meanings can only be made clear after much epistemological discussion."
Right.
And epistemological, I think we said that word a couple times last time, is the study of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So he's actually, you got to do the study of knowledge in order to figure out what knowledge means.
There's already a kind of recursive fold that's happening when you ask what is knowledge, because we're engaging in a conversation about how do we know what knowing is?
Yeah,
right.
And it's great that we begin this chapter with that, because I think we're going to see that over and over again.
Right.
As we discuss, as we go through the main concepts of conceptual versus perceptual knowledge, knowledge of things versus self-knowledge, propositional knowledge versus knowledge of a skill,
Right.
self-awareness. But so that's Bertrand Russell. Cool guy. Nagarjuna.
Nagarjuna is
Nagarjuna.
usually how I pronounce it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Do we know how to? I think. Yeah, it sounds good to me. Nagarjuna. It seemed like, if I understood correctly, they might not even know if this guy actually lived.
I think you're right. Nagarjuna is a figure, like many of ancient figures, a very early figure that we are aware of primarily because of reference to him from later.
Yeah.
Right. And preservation of texts that are attributed to him. In the same way, we don't know if Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, actually existed.
Really?
Yeah. Or if this is just a kind of reference to a kind of generic figure that these sayings were accumulated
You
around.
think Jesus falls in that category? Because we got a lot of folks went back and said, like,
Yeah.
no, this guy walked the earth. We've found him in a historic record.
Yeah, we have closer witness, even something as close as Paul for Jesus. That there's, like if you look at that and historians who've dug into it say, yeah, we know there probably was a guy
named Jesus
or name something that got associated with Jesus, and that he probably was born at some point, and at some point he died. Like, we know that. Like, all the rest is not anything we know with certainty, but certainty is its own problem, which is, I think, part of what we might talk about today,
we are
too.
going to talk about. So Nagarjuna, he did that dispelling of disputes was a big part of his thing. He was Mahayana. Was it Mahayana Buddhism?
He's an early Mahayana thinker.
Really big in that. And it was to know something is to know both it and the absence of it. It's negativa, right? Like, I know Grant because this is Grant, and then I know Grant by he's not everybody else. That's not as easy. The example they give in the book is, silence through, if we be quiet, that's silence, to know that silence, but it's also the absence of sound.
Yeah, I think that's a better kind of analogy of what I think Nagarjuna is getting at, because it's not just the negation of everything else. It's that when we know silence, we're knowing something that only exists in the negative, right? There's no positive content to silence, and yet silence is its own kind of presence to you in your awareness. And ultimately, what Nagarjuna, I think, is getting at is kind of, well, I mean, I don't think kind of, I think he's getting at the fundamental category of emptiness being
which is like Buddhism.
The fundamental category of reality. Yeah.
Right. That's the ultimate truth when they talk about it. It was like no self or emptiness.
Yeah, and I think it's Nagarjuna who ultimately puts forth the phrase, the emptiness of emptiness, because, even the concept of emptiness must be recognized as empty. Yeah.
Goodness. This is how it starts. And
Right.
This is what we're going to do for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Strap in. So,
and what does that have to do with knowing that I'm holding a cup, right?
Right. Oh,
which I'm not, I guess. But
I'm thirsty already. So this came to my mind when I was just trying to come up with a joke with you through text, of when I was sharing with you that I was like I was learning Nagarjuna and wanting to say, like, I'm being taught by Nagarjuna's teachings and not being taught by every other teacher, but it's not as clear as with silence.
Right. Yeah, but it's an interesting attention to the role of negation in knowing.
Well, I think of through the negative space, like, those artistic images where there'd be like a vase, but then if you look at it differently, it's two faces that are looking at each other, or you know what I'm saying, like where the negative space can be as dynamic as the positive.
Right, and I mean, those types of optical illusions are a good highlight of that. But if you talk to working artists, they're frequently, when I've talked to them about how you compose an image, attention to the negative space is often what distinguishes a skilled artist from someone who's just messing around, right?
Like, yeah.
So
yeah, and with music, they talk about the notes between the notes,
Right.
the space, and how that tells the story.
Right.
I love it. The next person, oh man, I'm going to butcher this name. It's okay. Phil Phails at saying what are probably Indian folks' names or Buddhist folks. Gendun Chopel. There's 2 little dots over the O. There's 2 little dots under the U. Gendun Chopel. Do you know this guy?
I'm trying to think who you're referencing here.
He comes in.
Oh, yeah. I don't know this figure. Yeah.
He comes in around.
He's a 20th century iconoclastic Tibetan philosopher, he says.
Yeah. Relationship between inference and perception.
Yeah, he's
The circularity of the warrants of knowledge and the contents of knowledge.
What'd you learn about him? Anything?
You know, I didn't dig deep on him. So I was hoping you might know something.
I don't. Yeah,
That's cool. What about Dignaga?
Dignaga?
Is he another Mahayana Buddhist thinker?
He is, and he's a really interesting figure because he's a student of Vasubandhu's, I believe, who's not mentioned in this article, but is a Tibetan thinker I'm very interested in, who is one of the founders of the Yogacara school, the mind-only school of Buddhism.
Okay.
And he is really responsible for establishing formal systems of logic within the Buddhist tradition. So when I talk about this sort of long-standing epistemological tradition and logical tradition in Buddhism, it really goes back to him.
Okay.
And he's not just influential on Buddhism. There's also a good sense that he's influential on Nyaya, which is basically a tradition of knowledge, of an epistemological tradition within Vedic thought, within Hindu thought.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Right on. The rest of these guys, I didn't do any real deep dives on them.
You just got so excited by Nagarjuna.
I really did.
Yeah.
He's cool.
Yeah.
And I was, by excited, I think it was difficult to wrap my head around it. So I was just like thinking about it and hearing someone speak about it for a long time and being confused. And that it was a mystery.
Right.
For me. The other guy is Wilfrid Sellars. We're going back to the Western side of things.
Sellars
with
is
Wilfrid Sellars.
an important
rationalist.
Yeah, he's an analytic American philosopher.
Seems like they associate him with Mill in some way.
I can see that. Yeah. I mean, he's much later.
He said experience does not count as knowledge until it is brought into the logical space of reasons.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There were Sellars. Who else do they cite? They talk about Strawson as well, and he's another big figure from. He's British, but from analytic philosophy. So, yeah, this article. I don't know if you like this article as much as the last one, or more or less. I like this article a lot more.
I did like it more. It was more steeped in Buddhism.
It's more steeped in Buddhism. It's more speaking about specific philosophers and their contributions instead of trying to paint these wide brushes of this is Theravada Buddhism, this is Mahayana Buddhism.
Right. It didn't do that.
Right.
Take you from nothing to like this is what philosophy is.
And like I said, I mean, I see the value of that if part of what you're doing is introducing people to these traditions to have that in the first article.
Yeah.
But I find I'm more responsive as a reader to specific thoughts by specific people that I can also contextualize and say, who is this person?
Yeah, and go look them up.
Right.
And and get excited.
Right.
I got more excited about this chapter as I found out about Bertrand Russell, as I found out about Nagarjuna, as I started to look into these other folks.
And then they also cite Gautier, I think was the other person, the analytic, who is, and they mention him briefly. He was the person who really identified certain, I don't know, you could think of them as paradoxes or problems with this analytic model, because the primary analytic model of knowledge is justified true belief.
Yeah, that's at the end when they talked about skill and acquaintance.
Right. And that is still, when I teach intro to philosophy and we talk about knowledge, it's still the baseline we move from, is justified true belief, because it's still the dominant way in Western philosophy we tend to think about knowledge.
Because they talked about that the subjective is the thing that tended to get moved towards. You can't justify the subjective mind,
right?
So then, if you can't, and is that knowledge? So the knowledge of the mind,
right,
versus the mind as an object. We'll get there, but
yeah. It's part of the problem is justification for certain things that seem like real knowledge can't happen. Part of the problem is there's these sort of weird paradoxes in that. But we'll definitely get there.
So those are the characters we're going to talk about.
I think you missed one other. It's not as. You talked about Sellars. It's not as. He mentions William James too.
Oh yeah, he does. William James, who he created a religion or something. What's up with William James? I've heard of this guy.
Yeah, William James
was he a poet?
No, maybe. Yeah.
If he was William Blake.
Well, Henry James is his brother and is a novelist. He wrote The Turn of the Screw. He wrote a number of other and short story writer. So his brother is a big figure in American literature.
Okay. William
James is he's really one of the founders of psychology as a discipline in the United States.
Okay.
But he's also a philosopher who is part of a group of philosophers that we refer to as pragmatist, which is really the only big homegrown school of philosophy coming out of the United States. And he's the person who coins the term pragmatism to describe what they're doing.
When I think of pragmatism, I think of philosophy that's practical that I could implement into my daily life. Is that what is pragmatism?
It's more about how you think about truth. Like James's argument is that truth is what it does for you.
Right.
Makes
sense.
Yeah. And so he even uses the phrase cash value, right? So and it's easy to kind of see that as crass or missing out on what is happening with truth, but he basically is saying look, when we create these series of representations, they're true because in using them we achieve a certain kind of goal that we're trying to achieve through them.
There's something about a return on an investment.
Right. And there's all these problems we have if we're trying to think about knowledge as a kind of representation of an external reality that we don't have an ability to check except through this knowledge that we're representing it through.
Yeah.
And he kind of circumvents that by saying, well, what we judge truth by then rightly is its ability to produce something for us that we want. And this, if you think about it, this is more anchored in and explicitly for James and the others in the pragmatist tradition in the actual practice of science, right? Mm-hmm. You're trying to understand something, and so you investigate it not by creating a series of representations and checking its correspondence so much as producing a set of actions in space and time through those representations that produce a set of results that you're trying to get to.
Desirable results.
Yeah.
Rock on. So those are the people.
But the other person, there's one other Buddhist philosopher. It's one of Dharmakirti, one of Digna.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to pronounce that name, so I think in my mind.
And I don't know much about Dharmakirti except that he's a commentator of Dignaga.
Yeah. So those are the characters for philosophy's big question: what is knowledge? And the structure of these, the main issues. I said it before. I'll just say it again: is conceptual versus perceptual knowledge. Knowledge of things versus self-knowledge, which is kind of, they say, self-awareness or acquaintance, by acquaintance. And then propositional knowledge as opposed to knowledge of a skill.
Right.
I think those are the main issues. And it starts off, I've got my notes here. It starts off with kind of like the importance or how to develop knowledge. Higher knowledge is what it calls it. Knowledge of that it goes through three phases for Buddhist thinkers to develop knowledge. One is to study a topic, and then to contemplate about a topic, and then to meditate on a topic. And as you do one as you progress through these three, you develop a higher level of knowledge, or what they called higher knowledge, discernment, or insight was achieved by going through all of these, which makes sense. Although more assimilation of meaning as one goes further is what it said. I wonder, like, when I don't know what they mean by meditate.
I think they mean meditate.
Right. I get studying. Like, I'm studying philosophy with you.
Right. And that's clearly what they're talking about there is there's a way you gain knowledge by reading, studying, listening to teachers.
Right, that's studying.
Right.
Contemplation is like, I'm thinking about this when I'm not looking, when I'm not. And what that means for me is, like, as I'm moving through the world and talking to people, I'm thinking about the discussions I'm having and the world that I'm living in through the context of what I've studied.
Right. And I think we talked about this last time, that deductive reasoning is a form of contemplation, right?
Right.
And it's part of why it's such a productive form for us is because I think it's an actually relatively natural form, right? We engage in deductive reasoning all the time. When we study logic, we're not learning to do something we don't already do. We're learning to do it with a greater level of precision, with a greater level of attention to the form, because we make mistakes when we just do it without doing that, right? And so we're really trying to eliminate those kinds of mistakes. There's cognitive biases, there's formal fallacies that we can fall into, where our natural tendencies to use deductive reasoning don't always work right. And some of that just has to do with the fact that it's a slow process. Most of our knowledge is social, which is, I think, when we talk about study, we're actually talking about a form of social knowledge. It's knowledge we derive from our community, through books, through conversations.
What have people read about something? What have people discovered? How do I take myself to the edge of what's known by finding out what people have said and done?
But then, and this is where I think you see a difference between Buddhism and Western thought, right? There's this notion of meditation that there's a kind of awareness, a kind of a knowledge that we can attain in particular types of meditative states that require a certain kind of technical skill to get to. That's why the discussion of technical knowledge at the end is interesting. Because when we talk about technical knowledge in the Western tradition, it's often, it's the knowledge of the ability to do something, right?
Yeah.
Which is different than how we represent that. We could, like if you're saying, how do you make an apple pie? You can put out a series of claims, right, and look at how they relate to each other.
Right.
A series of steps, you can represent it in language like that.
Right.
But that's different than the knowledge that you have that allows you to go make a pie.
Right.
Right.
That's like knowledge of versus knowledge of skill.
Right, yeah.
Which we'll talk about later.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that meditation within Buddhism seems to be a kind of skill.
Yeah. Well,
that gets you to a certain type of awareness that's more like perceptual knowledge.
Don't you hone the ability to, like, realize a certain frequency in the brain, whether it's like delta? I've got this binaural beats where you can play them, and they've got different states. And I've heard that when skilled meditators meditate, they reach this level or this type of frequency range in their brain, whether it's theta or delta. I don't remember the exact one. But so they're actually tuning their brain differently.
We know from the person whose work I know most is Andy Newberg, who has studied. He's one of the first people who started hooking up brain imaging.
Yeah. Did he take the Buddhists and he brought them over to America, and then he's...
he had Tibetan Buddhist meditators. Right. He had nuns who were praying, like all sorts of contemplative states, and identified certain types of brain states,
unique
activation of the frontal lobe, that are associated with certain and part of what's interesting, I remember from when I was reading his stuff, is that he identified at least two different kinds of contemplative states in terms of the neurological patterns we see. One associated with the quieting of the mind, and one associated with like visionary types of contemplation. And there are different kinds of neurological states, but there are also types of neurological states we don't see associated with other activities.
Yeah.
So yeah, something's going on. Now, whether that means we're tuning into some sort of frequency or not, that's a speculative step.
Yeah.
I think we should be hesitant to jump there too quickly. We know it's associated with that there are certain types of brain states associated with certain types of contemplative states. And yeah, from the Buddhist perspective, I think that's what they're talking about with meditation. They're talking about these kinds of modes of awareness that come from certain types of mental practices.
Yeah. One last thing on this level of knowledge thing that struck me was this idea of contemplation being something that I need to actively do. And I found, I maybe questioned that for a bit, because I was actively engaged in the study. I was excited about it. And so it just penetrated my life in a lot of ways that made contemplation effortless. Mm-hmm. It was just like, I'm excited to follow down this path. And I don't know that I actively contemplated, that I sat down and said, I'm going to contemplate time. It was more like it flowed out of an engaged, it spilled over from engaged study, passionate study. Mm-hmm.
No, it's a good question. What do we mean by contemplation? And does, like, if I'm out in the garden, and I just read this chapter, all right, I'm weeding stuff, I'm engaging in all this labor, and then my brain just kicks in and is like starting to think about that. Is that contemplation? Yes. Or does it require some sort of like intentionality to contemplate and some level of discipline about how I think through that? I think both. I think we're better served by both. I think naturally, both are and both are contemplation, right?
Yeah.
The second type of thing, which is I think maybe what they're trying to get to when they say you need to actively engage in it, is more about making sure that when you're contemplating, you're doing it well, right? Well, like that you're making sure you're pulling it off for what you want to accomplish. In the same way, anything else, right? If I am distracted while I'm doing one thing by another thing, I'm not going to do that one thing as well. So if I can bring focus to the act of contemplation and take care with how I make the steps in that contemplation through some sort of formal system, right? Yeah. Then I can be more assured, given that there's evidence that that formal system produces better thoughts.
You'll get there.
That I'll get there, right?
You know, what came to mind was there's this saying that I think we've had in America, or at least in my lifetime, of practice makes perfect.
Right.
And what I've started hearing later in my life, and what I think applies here, is that practice makes permanent.
Right.
And that came to mind when you said, are you contemplating well?
Right.
Because how you contemplate is going to dictate the results you have and the outcomes, or the where you land with regard to what you're this level 2.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, it's not as directly related because, it's partly the study side, but I think in terms of like the plurality of crazy ideas we encounter in the world, right?
Yeah.
Right now, especially in the internet age, of people who have done research, right?
Right.
And, as someone who's a trained researcher, I often look at what they're doing. I'm like, that's not research, but they've habituated to an idea that research is just going and gathering stuff that seems to look good and fits together in a cool way, right?
In a compelling way that people that gets views.
Right. And I think that's part of what's driving it, is that attention getting is driving the research.
A certain type of research. Where they're probably prioritizing provocative content in their research. Maybe.
Right. And so I think, you can do things and do things well or do things poorly, and you're still doing that thing. You're just doing a bad job.
Yeah.
Right.
Your outcome will be impacted.
Right, absolutely.
By how you do it.
Absolutely.
Next thing we go to is this. I think we kind of go back to the first chapter to some extent for a little bit. They talk about perfection of knowledge and liberating knowledge. I kind of like that idea of like knowledge is in here all the time, and you're like, let's free the knowledge from inside of ourselves. Like we're liberating knowledge within ourselves.
I don't think they're talking about liberating knowledge from within ourselves.
From the world?
No, I think we're talking about knowledge that is liberating. That liberates you, right?
That frees you in some way.
Right. And in a Buddhist context, I mean, liberation has a very specific notion.
Thinking of that totally different. I was thinking of like Legend of Zelda.
Like let's let knowledge free.
Like princesses that
it's all trapped in the crystals. We just need to shatter the crystals, and we can.
This knowledge frees you. That makes so much sense now.
Yeah, and that comes back to the end of the chapter where he talks about yogic knowledge.
Yes,
where and that's where someone like James comes in. The standard of truth is not some idea of some sort of correspondence to a reality that we don't necessarily even have access to, except through this knowledge.
Yeah,
the standard of truth is: does it lead to liberation?
Right. Yeah, and this is where they talk about for a second this idea that knowledge is paired with practices, which seem like virtues. They're talking about knowledge is the vision, the sight, and the practice or the methods, which they kind of generosity, discipline, and patience are the ones they cite. And it seems like that's virtuosity, like being virtuous. That's the legs. And both of these together provide insight into the ultimate truth of no self or emptiness of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is where we start to get to and we'll just go straight into the first one, which is, Nagarjuna, this is where we dip into Nagarjuna, where they talk about content less and content full around the ultimate truth. Right? And it gets confusing, man. A lot of things they say in here are confusing, and I have to read over and over again. Whether it's status of knowledge, valid or not, is determined by the status of the object known and vice versa. And it took me a while to understand that. But what I think what I landed with, and I'm just going to be willing to fail here, is that the object is only known through the existence of a knower, of me.
Yeah.
So there can't be object knowledge without someone observing, someone thinking about the object.
Right. No, I mean, this is something that when you dig into kind of the hollowed corners of philosophy, you'll encounter, something that seems as straightforward as an object is actually very difficult to get at. What is an object? And especially he kind of identifies it with rationalist traditions. Yeah. I'm not sure I'd say it's rationalism per se, although I think there's a certain kind of psychologism, at least here, right? That objects are constituted by the act of knowing, right? That there is no object out there.
It's kind of this, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound type of thing.
Yeah, to some extent. Right, yeah, because it and initially that seems like, oh yeah, of course it does. But
you need something, you need an observer for there to be something observed.
Right. And we're not saying when a tree falls in a woods.
It certainly puts out a frequency, but if nothing captures that frequency.
That experience of sound doesn't occur.
And the truth is it doesn't make a sound.
Right. And I think when you think about color.
It's got to be picked up by some collector of the frequency for there to be sound. Only exists within the context of an ear. It's just wavelengths, right?
Right, exactly. Although even the concept of wavelengths is its own kind of highly rarefied object we've created as part of our knowing of
this
the
is another
universe.
object, right?
Yeah. Hume, I think, gets at this in a way that is helpful. He's a Scottish philosopher, Enlightenment philosopher. When he tries to figure out what happens when we know, he says, look, we basically have two kinds of knowledge, right? We have impressions, two types of thoughts that we can think of as thoughts about the world. Mm-hmm. We have impressions, and we have relationships of ideas, right? And that's kind of parallels.
That's rationalism and imperialism. That's
rationalism
concepts and perceptions.
Right, yeah, it's concepts and perceptions.
The experience of something through our senses versus
and so
logic and ideas.
Yeah, and I think, and we see that from the Buddhist tradition. We see that, but he says, well, let's break this down even further. We have simple representations within our relationships of ideas, or let's go back to impressions. We have simple impressions and we have complex impressions, right? And simple impressions are the raw sensory input.
Simple impressions are the experience of something.
The experience itself, right?
Something, the pins in my hand.
And then we generate ideas from those, and then we put those into relationship with each other, and then we have complex impressions. Well, by the time we get to complex impressions, we're already in a conceptual world. And you think about something as easy as like holding an apple and saying, I'm holding an apple. Already, a red apple, right? Already you're engaging words. All these words that are
holding
these
apple,
generalities,
you're
right?
Beyond experience.
Right, you're beyond experience. And everything is like that. The minute you begin to conceptualize through language, you're stepping away from that raw experience.
You're in conceptual. You're reasoning. You're putting it in relation to other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And they talk about that where we quickly kind of get there. I have a lot of things where, for the next couple pages, it's about perception versus inference. Perceptual, inferential.
Yep.
The knowledge and the contents of knowledge is what they call it. In Buddhist epistemology, it said that there was a binary between species of coherentism or radically relational, which seemed to be this perceptual, and foundationalism, which was a special kind of perception, meditation, yogic perception.
This is where do you put down page numbers when you?
No, do you want me to?
It's helpful.
I can start.
Yeah,
I can start. But this all will go in order. So we're right past the Gendun Chopel stuff.
Yeah,
where he talks about the relationship between inference and perception. And that thing where they talked about perception of smoke confirms clear eyesight, where they're kind of talking about the knower and the known kind of mutually arise or mutually confirming. Yeah.
Yeah. No, what you're talking about is interesting, and I don't remember that. So this is part of why I love reading with others.
Yeah.
Because no matter how careful a reader you are,
people are going
to focus on different things. And I'm just like, where is that?
It's right before how things are when they start talking about. I should get the book, or I could pull it up and probably run it down. But it's where they kind of talk about the two different sides of Buddhist epistemology,
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. All right. Well, we can come back to that, but
what does that mean to you? Species of coherentism. Radically relational. Relational is the logical side, though, right? Radically relational is this universal generalization of things, like fire. I know fire; it's everywhere. It's purely, universal. Versus, I have a match in my hand, burning my hand. That's this one sensation.
So, and they're talking about the difference between coherentism and foundationalism, which are big debates in analytic philosophy about systems of knowledge, right? Do we judge a system of knowledge as true, right? As a good system of knowledge, as a valid system of knowledge, because it produces a coherent system, right? And we evaluate claims within that system to the degree to which they operate coherently within that system. A good way to think about a coherentist system is geometry, right? When you look at geometry as a pure system of knowledge, it exists because we set out a set of principles, and we can then produce more propositions that show themselves to be true because they operate coherently within those principles and with each other, right?
Okay.
Its warrant for truth is not necessarily how true those foundational principles are, but how much those allow us to have a whole coherent system.
Each principle validates all the other principles when they all work together.
And it's usually, coherentism is usually a form of anti-foundationalism, right? The argument would be like, we know with Euclidean geometry that if we say that parallel lines never come together, that we can create a coherent geometric system. Well, it turns out if we change that, we can create non-Euclidean geometric systems, right? Foundationalism tends to be something we use to describe systems of knowledge or ways of understanding knowledge that say that there are foundational principles that we know to be true, and we build knowledge from building from those foundations up.
Okay.
Right? And that seems to be a debate that happens within traditions of philosophy across the board. Right?
Yeah, also the Buddhists.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, and, when Euclid creates Euclidean geometry, he's not thinking I'm just creating some abstract coherent system, right? He's saying these definitions, these common notions, right? Yeah. What we think of as axioms. The axioms of the system are there because they're things we simply accept as true because we know they're true, either because we intuit them or we see them as the case
foundational
all the time, right? They're foundations. And then we can build a system of truth from that. And that's often the quest of rationalist philosophy through Western philosophy. What can we know for sure? And, during the Middle Ages, often those are claims that are, that God exists. We know that God exists.
So you're starting with bedrock that's not necessarily...
We can build from there.
You can't prove God exists.
Right, exactly. And when you look at a rationalist like Anselm, he's like, only the fool denies God exists because it's a foolish notion, right? This is why, and goes through it, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And that's foundationalism.
Right. And foundationalism has been very hard to uphold. There are certainly philosophers who are trying to still develop foundations, and even other intellectual traditions. Like
we've got an obvious coherentism guy here,
right? You, me, this guy?
I don't know. You?
Yeah, I think I'm a coherentist.
Because you're saying it's hard to uphold.
No, I think it is.
Because I imagine there's a lot of people that would say today, like, we're upholding this.
No, I think the question is it hard to uphold because we haven't done the work to get there effectively yet, or is it hard to uphold because fundamentally they aren't there?
Well, yeah. Yeah.
And yeah. I don't know how foundations would work, because I think there's fundamental problems with what it is to be a knowing being.
How they're
in this situation we're in. Right. Yeah.
Seems like they're doing some smoke and mirrors or gaslighting on people. At least the thing you said about God exists, he has to exist because it's a foolish notion to think that he doesn't exist. Only a fool would believe that. This seems to be some gaslighting.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that foundationalism often requires you to then explain why people, if it's so clear, if it's so foundational, why do we make mistakes? Why do we have errors, right? And I think as a thinking being caught in the situation we're in, which, I'm following someone like Heidegger, I think we experience ourselves as a fundamental level as thrown into a world that we don't understand and have to make sense of.
Yeah.
Right? The assumption that making sense is somehow finding some external foundation that I just have to anchor in beyond my own experience of being a thinking being in this state of throwness. I don't know. It's abhorrent to me. I mean, I think probably part of it, it's just dispositional. Like, I'm like, yeah, screw that. Like, I don't that's me submitting to some other thing instead of being, a free being trying to understand my world.
It's like external referencing versus internal referencing in some way. That makes sense. Ugh. When I heard you say the Heidegger stuff of making sense of the world, the thought came like we're going to make sense of it to the degree that we're skilled or intelligent or have a thirst for knowledge or yeah, how does that even work? Goodness. We're all creating different meaning from the world.
Right.
And some of it comes from smoke and mirrors because we're nature versus nurture. Like some of it's like how much processing power we have or desire to focus that processing power. And then in others, like we're raised as fundamental Jehovah's Witnesses or something. I'm not putting down any religious thing. I'm just saying to be exposed to something is to get that that foundationalism, as opposed to being exposed to like, oh, go out and figure things out. And
yeah, I think if I were going to describe myself epistemologically, I'd say I'm a pluralist, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that from my experience and my investigation of this, it seems that making sense of the world requires you to accept often fundamentally contrasting perspectives that can't always be reconciled into a system that brings them all together as a coherent whole, but each in their own way provides sort of coherent perspectives that you as a thinking being nevertheless can integrate through a life, through a lived experience, right? And sometimes it's more it goes back to when we were talking about ethical knowledge, right?
Yeah.
We have utilitarianism versus Kantian ethics versus virtue ethics. And initially it seems like these are just these big competing theories and no one knows which.
But it's actually all of them together.
Right. It's all of them together, but it's not all of them together come together into some sort of coherent whole that I can say, there's the system of ethics.
Right.
It's that in different moments, different approaches produce a better kind of way of living, right? I think it's scary to people because it becomes more difficult to have the final arbiter that says, you're right, you got it.
We really want that.
We do.
I really want that.
Yeah. I don't. I think certainty is terrifying. It's like a knife that slices you through the throat.
Well, certainly being with uncertainty with... well, just that sentence. Certainly being with uncertainty...
Right.
With like some level of calm or acceptance or grace or whatever we want to say it is beneficial in the human experience because it is all we have. Uncertainty is the plight of the human.
Right.
Like, I don't know what's going to happen. I could go find someone I call Nostradamus who's going to tell me what's going to happen and then believe in that and call whatever happens next conscious manifestation and put it within the, do mental gymnastics to make it what I thought it was going to be. But life is uncertain.
Right. I think it's even trickier than that. Because it's not that life is uncertain.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it is that life is uncertain if we think of it this way. It's not that uncertainty is a lack of the kind of knowing we associate with the term certainty. It's that we only ever get partial pictures.
Yeah.
We only ever get partial knowings.
Yeah.
Right? And whether it's Buddhist, foundational rationalists, Christian, etc., I'm suspicious of systems when they present themselves as the answer.
The answer, yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
As total, right?
Yeah.
As a sort of absolute system.
You have it's a jack of all trades kind of thing.
Right. And yet there are better ways of doing things than others, right?
Yeah.
There are better ways of knowing than others. The problem is we do see examples of very toxic to ourselves, to our societies, modes of delusion, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We do see, we experience from the beginning errors, right? I think one of the problems that brings us to something like philosophy is just the recognition that we sort of form a knowledge of the world. We're going up the stairs and we think that there are 20 stairs and there's actually 18, and we have that experience at the end where we step down expecting a step and it's not there.
Right.
And we're like, we were wrong. Like, how's that happen?
How does that happen?
Right? Yeah. And so we can see that there are these moments where we can have greater or lesser precision.
These are glitches in the matrix.
Right. I think of them more like limits in calculus. Did you study calculus at all?
Not much.
Okay, so like when you're defining a curve, right?
Yeah.
You're defining it mathematically as an algorithm approaching a point that doesn't exist in that curve.
Right.
So we have to set these kinds of foundations out there, these axioms.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm going the wrong way because axioms usually are at the beginning instead of the end. But I'm getting totally confused. But we have to have these points of precision as goals. I guess maybe is a way to think of it.
Yeah.
But accepting that we don't get there.
Yeah.
Now, I think Buddhism as a system, like it's as a religion especially, it's saying, no, you can get to that goal. Like do these things that the Buddha taught us.
The Buddha awakening.
Right.
The Four Noble Truths.
And you can be liberated.
Yeah. And that brings us back to, I guess, the next thing. They talk about how things are. And on one side, I guess this is in Buddha epistemology too. On one side, there's a denial of any final nature of reality,
mm-hmm.
which is basically saying there is no how things are.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting way to answer that question. How things are, and I know there is no how things are, versus experiential ground of reality, ontological, unified experience of truth, which was like that Buddha's awakening thing.
Yeah, no, that's part of what's interesting me about Buddhist philosophy is it confronts this same set of problems around how we know reality through our knowledge systems,
mm-hmm.
right? But instead of giving up like I do, right? It says, no, that awareness that this thing you call self, that seems so fundamental, like that there's a me that is aware,
mm-hmm.
is a false concept. It's an illusion.
Because there's no self.
Right, there's no
emptiness.
self. Right. That there is any content of the world beyond that emptiness.
How can I get to that conclusion?
Right.
Though?
Right. So that you get that, like it seems like an anti-foundationalism, right?
Yeah.
But then it says recognizing that, creates the space of a kind of naked awareness, to use a Buddhist phrase, right? An awareness of things as they are that transcends that conceptual representation, not because it gives you a better representation, not because it gives you the proper label, not because it gives you the proper foundation, but because it allows you to recognize that the fundamental nature of reality is its lack of foundation.
Yeah.
And that's just mind bending, right? That sounds like nonsense when you think about it.
When they say no self or emptiness, they're saying that this person that is the observer of my sensations, I'm almost saying myself in the third person, this whatever, the seat of consciousness, this observer in me, they're saying that doesn't exist.
That does not exist as a fundamental thing, right? That as a thing in itself, right?
Well, what the heck is it? Like, who am I?
Well, the word they use is this word skanda, which means heaps, or we often translate as aggregate. That you're kind of like, you're just an aggregate of sensations and thoughts that's kind of knotted up in reality and created this illusion of a kind of singular thing.
That's this universal consciousness? Is that what that is? What do you mean when you say aggregate? That's a part of a whole, right?
Right. Like it's just this sort of this stuff. Like like I said, skandhas is often translated as heaps. It's stuff or piles. It's stuff that's kind of piled up onto like different kinds of things that have just kind of piled up until you have this pile of stuff that you said, well, that's a thing, but it's really just this pile of stuff, right? And then ultimately, if you follow someone like Nagarjuna, even those things that are piled up are their own nature is to be piles of other things. Yeah, I mean, it's hard.
There's an ickiness to it.
Right. There's
like, I want to have purpose. I want to be special.
Right.
And I think that's where they're talking about this rawness, this naked truth of
right.
You're not special.
Right.
This is like Fight Club just came to mind. The walking, talking
right.
trash of the world.
Right.
We're garbage.
Right.
And piles.
Right. We're just piles. And I think, partly when we first confront this, it seems like this sort of anti-ego psychological game. Like it's like a lesson in humility. I mean, this is part of why I think humility, compassion are so fundamental to Buddhism, right? They're not fundamental to Buddhism because Buddhists are trying to be nice, right?
Right.
They're not fundamental to Buddhism because Buddhists are necessarily invested in producing certain types of social systems like families, like we talked about, the Buddha is one of the original deadbeat dads.
Right.
They're invested in those because those contribute to liberation, right? And one of the first ways we begin to recognize our lack of self is through altruism, through compassion, through an orientation to others and the importance of others and the way we value others.
Stop thinking about yourself.
Right.
Stop investing energy in growing this ego.
Right.
Start growing others, and that makes this smaller.
Right. And, I remember when I would go and watch Buddhist teachers when I was a graduate student, and they're talking about Buddhist, they would say, Westerners often when they come to Buddhism, they want to meditate, right?
Yeah.
Meditate, because it's cool. Like you get these great states of mind. And they're like, you can't do that without the entirety of the Eightfold Path, part of which is this
reducing
this training of ethical life, right?
Yeah.
Of a certain kind of way we behave and conduct ourselves as lives, because that's part of the foundation of producing this awareness as much as the meditation, right?
God dang. That one struck me. So we next we get to we're still down this road, but they talk about.
Sorry, I jump around a lot too.
No, that's great. That one's oof. I'm grateful for that. Yeah, it gives me a different experience of Buddhism. It's just different. Not in a good or bad way, just they're going towards liberation. And part of that, I guess the word that came to me was this ego death that people talk about. Mm-hmm. And it is this ego reduction or at least there is no ego. That is a manifestation of.
And I think part of what we have here when we look at knowledge is the recognition that ego death, if we want to use that language, is not just about sort of a self-absorption on a ethical or social level, but even the way ego functions to create categories, right?
Yeah.
And wants to hold. I mean, when we think about that grasping, that craving within the Four Noble Truths, right?
Yeah.
Life is suffering. Life is impermanence. What leads to that? It's our grasping. It's our craving. That's the ego wanting to hold on to a coherent picture of reality. That's the ego wanting to find these foundations. And there's a level at which the mind that wants to do that has to be led to a recognition of the fundamental. And I think this is what thinkers like Nagarjuna are getting at, the fundamental recognition that these are also empty categories.
Yeah.
As empty as, the ways we think about our lives in our own selfishness, right? And contribute to this egoism. But when you start to think about what it would be to be aware without that, it's absolutely terrifying.
Terrifying.
Right? It's absolutely...
It is terrifying. There's a bit of like looking into...
Right. And
like a void, like a real void.
Right. And I think there's real danger there, right? Without the container of a Sangha, without the container of these...
The three
right.
What diamonds?
Of this long tradition of the Dharma,
the
right?
Teacher, the Sangha.
Right. And without the teachers...
And the
there's a way you can go off the rails really fast with this kind of thing, right? And start murdering people in the subways in Japan.
Oh my God.
Right? Like think about that. Like, when the Om cult that set off you remember this, don't you? Mm-hmm. That set off the nerve toxin in the subways in Japan. They were a Buddhist cult.
I didn't know they were a Buddhist cult.
Yeah. And you can get into dangerous spaces, I think, if you're not careful here.
Yeah. That's when we're kind of coming back to this idea of contemplation, the right way of contemplating.
Right.
Because if you don't do it the right way, then you get to these fallacies, or you get to answers that can lead to really, undesirable results in the world,
right,
and in your own behavior, and in
right, which is why I think, like, even though it's not in this chapter, the focus on suffering in Buddhism is very helpful, right? If what I'm doing seems to be producing more suffering in the world, it's probably not the right path, right? If my fundamental recognition I'm beginning with is that there's suffering and that sucks. Like, I suffer.
Yeah.
I'm unsatisfied with life, producing more suffering and lack of satisfaction for others.
Yeah. Is not the path of liberation.
Is not the path of liberation.
We're having less suffering.
Right.
Not participating in that cycle of suffering. Right. Back to so the next thing they talk about, I guess. Well, not the next thing. We've kind of gone off on tangents,
right.
Which I love. I think that's a part of this. We've been going for about an hour.
Yeah.
Is something they'll talk about for the next while. And I actually, in my notes, I just wrote a line down the middle, and I separated conceptual versus perceptual knowledge.
Right.
And then I just put everything they talked about either fell into the perceptual side, which is awareness through senses, perception, particulars. They use a lot of words for this. Unmistaken conceptual perception, no words, lack of communicability, and determinacy, empiricism. All of these fell on the perception side, perceptual knowledge. And then through the conceptual side, it was ideas, principles, inference, evidence, reasoning, universals, general universals, linguistic entities, concept of distributed entity, a class of things held by the same across space and time, distortions of reality, mistaken conceptual thoughts, rationalism, logic, coherence, reason, rationality as the arbiter of true knowledge, communicable, rationally justified, which will take us kind of to the end when we talk about justifiable truth. That was kind of the next couple pages for me, was this divide between concept and precept.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think it's an extremely useful way to organize how we think about knowledge. Part of what I like about this chapter is, and it's a long-standing way we organize knowledge in Western philosophy. It shows how central this way of organizing knowledge is to Buddhist philosophy as well, in an independent tradition, right? And if you think about things, right, you just use your conceptual knowledge to think through things, and you think about it. Yeah, there seem to be two ways we know things. We know things because we perceive things. Like, I know there's a house across the street from you because I can see it, right? And we know things because we've thought it through, right? And the question then, if you're talking about empiricism versus rationalism, is where does knowledge come from? Is knowledge ultimately a kind of rational endeavor that helps us with perceptual knowledge? Or is knowledge ultimately that we see and understand the world and that we can validate our coherent systems of knowledge through engagement and validation in the world, right?
Well, would there be knowledge without experience?
I think that's one of the questions, right? That's why I tend to, as much weight as I put in rational systems, they're enormously productive. I can't even conceptualize what a rational system would be like outside of the context of experience, right? It's even the very fundamental categories by which I can build a rational system, like shape, or line, are things I arrive at through experience. I don't arrive at those outside of experience.
Right.
And even as abstract entities, to be able to think with them and do the work of something like geometry, I need to have that anchor in reality. Even with something like number, right? Are numbers things that exist outside of our experience of number? Or are numbers things that we have because we've been able to note that there are multiplicities of certain types in the world, right? And then we begin to associate number with that. I also think it's a very hard question, and I'm not sure that we will ever get at an answer to that.
For some reason, as we talk about the difference between concept and precept, I think of this binary between mind and body.
Yeah, I mean, I think that fits because
concept is the mind,
right,
and we've got sensory input,
right,
and that's the body,
right,
and where I've landed on the mind body thing is that they're one. Like you can't have one without the other, right. And they are, it's this idea when, I've done dialectical behavioral therapy and I've done, these different self-help things, and they talk about black and white thinking. Mm-hmm. And whenever you have folks that are telling you that it's a binary, there's some place in the middle, right, where things land.
Right.
There can't be a body without a mind, and there can't be a mind without a body, and those things are intrinsically linked. And I think that's where they next start to talk about,
well, when he talks about knowledge by acquaintance and self-awareness, I think he begins to get at that.
Bridging the gap between content-free perception and conceptual cognition. Well, they talk about they talk about what joins concept and precept. Mm-hmm. And they have a couple ways to get there by adding perceptions, mm-hmm, right? They add 3 perceptions to our normal 5 senses, right? Well, we all know sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. They add mental perception, self-awareness, and yogic perception.
Right. Yeah, I think part of what contemplative traditions like Buddhism bring to the table is, are there modes that are better understood as perceptual modes than conceptual modes?
Because mental perception is almost making conceptual perceptual.
Right.
Well, everybody's going to say, I'm just going to take this one and put it over here.
Let's go back to I love geometry, like if you haven't found. Like, let's say you're doing a geometric proof. Doing Proposition 47, the Pythagorean proof, mm-hmm, in the first book of the Elements in Euclid, right? You've built all these steps, you have all these deductive things of reasoning. You can sit there and work through them and follow the rules. And I do this with my students when we work on geometry, because I use geometry as a mode of teaching deductive reasoning. And it's any of the propositions. Like, you can go through the rules and you can understand you're following the rules. But there's this moment where you know you did the proof right because you can see it. Right?
Experience.
Right? You have a moment of recognition of the truth of the proof. Right?
Because you experience it.
Because you experience, because you, and I think, and it's
So
not.
one is almost leading a horse to
Right.
water.
And and it's not that you see it like visually, because you're just working through an abstract proof.
Right.
It's that you recognize it. I think that's what they're getting at with mental perception.
A felt sense.
That
of
moment of recognition of the truth of the thing you've been working on. And I think we experience that all the time, right? When we're writing, when we're cooking, when we're doing there's these moments where we recognize that we've got it. And like any other perception, it can be delusional and it's hard to validate.
Right. And it lives, and you can't, how do you even share that?
Right. And it's like sometimes people get hung up like, well, yeah, you could be wrong, but you can be wrong when you're using your visual perception, right? That's perception is subject to error.
Well, humans are subject
Right.
to, we're imperfect beings. We're on Phails.
Right, exactly.
We're imperfect beings. There's no such thing as,
Right.
Yeah,
and I mean, like, how do you validate visual perception? You say to your buddy, hey, do you see that?
Yeah.
How do you validate
But then
geometric
we got folks that are
perception?
like, there's definitely Bigfoot. I saw a Bigfoot.
Right, sure. There's always limit cases, but most of the time when we check and like, do you see that house across the street?
We'd be like,
I see the house.
There's a house across
right.
the street. So
most
this is
of the
consensus.
Right. Most of that, and I think that it's not any different with mental perception. How do we validate that the proof was right?
A bunch of people.
Like,
and this
do you
is science.
see it?
This is science.
Yeah.
To reproduce something and
Right.
get the same results.
But it requires
over
that,
and over again.
Right. But what is that result? That result is ultimately another subjective being saying, I followed the method.
I got the experience.
I got the same
found
experience.
That truth.
But we don't necessarily have an ability to share that experience. We only have the ability to map that experience with each other and say, oh, yeah, we are having the same experience.
And yet the map is not the territory.
Right.
Like we can all say, we could all go to, yeah, we're coming to the same truth, but there's no way we're doing it the exact same.
Yeah, there's always going to be like minor variations.
Or big variations.
No matter
different humans get there differently.
Right. And we can try to...
Just like if you climb to the top of a 14er. Like for some reason I thought of Colorado or a mountain.
Right.
We all see that mountain. But we see it differently, whether it's by the angle, or I thought of this idea of this number on the ground, and you see it as a 9 and I see it as a 6. It's a shape.
Right.
And it is a 9 and it is a 6.
Right, and we can even say, oh, well, that's because 9 and 6 are just flipped from each other, and we recognize, why we have different experiences around a common shape. There's other times we don't. I think the mountain climbing metaphor is good, because even with
we're not going to take the exact same path.
Right, even with a very well-established
trail. You're going to take different footfalls, different gates.
There's variations in the weather.
But you're going to experience climbing a 14er.
Right.
You're going to climb to the top of that mountain. You're going to be tired. You're going to experience natural beauty and isolation.
And there's going to be a solidarity between people who have had that same experience, that you had of climbing that mountain, that particular mountain, even as you recognize there are these minor variations, right? Yeah. There's this. So, yeah, part of what's interesting is there's this commonality of perceptual experience, even as we recognize these variations.
Right.
I think we often want greater and greater solidarity. We want greater commonality. And I think that can be useful, right? If we're trying to entrain ourselves with other humans around a set of tasks, right? Mm-hmm. If we're trying to build a house together, it's enormously useful if we have a common sense of measure.
Yeah, this is the...
If you think 2 inches is different than I think 2 inches, we're going to run into all sorts of problems.
Absolutely.
But do we need certainty, or do we need precision? And precision's different than certainty, because precision...
Well, the ruler is precision.
Right, precision
but it provides certainty.
Is a gradient. Precision seeks certainty.
Yeah, you can't provide it. Because if I have a ruler, I cannot put a line. You give 100 people a ruler and tell them mark out 6 inches, and none of them.
There's always going to be some minor variation.
This is like the idea of simplicity. The closer you get to any task, the closer you look at it, simplicity goes away.
Right.
Because everything is complex.
Right.
And the closer you look at a pin strike on 6 inches or 4 inches or whatever, the closer you get to it. I know this as I'm like editing these videos. Sometimes I've got to stitch together audio, and I look at it from afar, and it looks like those two audio clips are together. And I zoom in and I zoom in, and they're a little bit further, and I take them close, and I zoom in and I zoom in. Oh, man, they're really far apart. The closer you zoom in, no two things are going to be exactly the same place.
Right.
So you don't get to... Yeah, I see what you're saying. You don't... It seeks precision, but you don't get consistency. Is that what the other thing was? Precision and...
Certainty. Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. Like, and...
Gosh.
Because there's always going to be some variation, right? There, you just have to zoom in for. And I mean, I think the more important question is usually, for what I'm trying to accomplish with this way of knowing, what is the level of precision I need?
That's where getting to that William James, that whole like, what is the cash value?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
right. We got to live in this thing. We can't have. Right?
Yeah. Which is what leads us to that.
How much do you zoom in?
Right.
You're saying before we call it good.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you can spend all day zooming in and getting it more and more precise.
Let's tidy it in. Let's
tidy
zoom
it up
in more. Let's instead of working on this house, let's develop magnification to make sure that all the 6 inches are the same.
And y'all are just like working on that first board.
In the rain.
Right? You're great.
You're in the rain.
Exactly. Like the world comes in and disrupts it.
Yeah, it's snowing on you.
You lose time, right? Yeah, there's all sorts of problems with that. I mean, I think
diminishing returns is what we're talking about.
I think if we identify knowledge with certainty, we run into a number of problems because it's too high a standard for knowledge. It's just...
Well, does it exist? Well,
I mean, it exists.
Certainty perfection?
I think certainty
is perfection, and perfection doesn't exist.
I think, I was going to say, I think certainty exists as much as a point or a line exists, right? They seem to have some recognizable in shared conceptual existence.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting because we can imagine things that we don't say we have a shared conceptual existence.
There's not a point.
But there's not an actual, like you can't have an actual
make
point.
A point.
Right.
I could try, but that's...
Right.
But that's going to be a shape that's going to be imperfect.
Right.
This is art. The art is humans. I'm going to make a statement. It's neither true nor false. Art is a human being, trying to execute with perfection or precision or certainty, and wabi-sabi, being with the way that it is imperfect, creates the variability. Because we all want to make great music. We all want to make great art, and we're striving for that.
Right.
But what makes us different is how we're imperfect in executing that art.
Yeah, that is part of why I love abstract expressionism so much as a mode of visual art, because it seems that that's what abstract expressionists are often playing with. How do we play with form? How do we play with color? How do we play with these fundamental modes of producing visual fields that brings this balance between something coherent and precise enough to say, that's beautiful, but to have enough variation. I particularly like, you go to the Blant Never?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, they have a nice collection of Latin American abstract expressionism, which we don't talk a lot about in an Anglo-American sphere because it's a Spanish language tradition. But part of what I love about some of those Latin American artists they have there is many of them are working with geometric forms in a way that I really think does play with this sort of play between precision of shape as a mode of beauty and openness to kind of the fluidity and dynamics and chaos of life as a mode of beauty.
Yeah. Talking about concept versus precept, certainty versus precision.
And then knowing how and yogic perception is the last section.
Yeah. Well, let's sit with self-awareness for a little bit. What's your time?
Well, yeah, I got about 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, do you want to... So just self-awareness for 1 second.
Yeah, knowledge by acquaintance. Yeah. Go ahead.
That's where we talk about object versus subjectivity, right? Which we kind of talked about in the beginning. Non-thetic. What does non-thetic mean?
Non-propositional.
Non-propositional.
Yeah.
And that means non-conceptual, because proposition is concepts.
Yeah, I mean, right. So if I back up a minute, I mean, this might help. In analytic philosophy, which Strawson and Gautier, which is where they're talking about this, are operating, there's a notion that knowledge is let's go back to this justified true belief. What does that mean? It means that if we're talking about knowledge, one of the things we're talking about is a belief, right? In order to have knowledge, it has to be a belief.
Right.
How do you express a belief? You express a belief as a proposition, as a statement.
Okay.
Right? And then the end of it is that you have that statement, there's a house across the street. It's true. If there is actually a house across the street, you have knowledge. But you can say there's a house across the street, and you can have that belief, and the house could be across the street, but you have no basis for that.
Yeah, we can close that curtain.
Right. You're just guessing, and you happen to be right. If you're guessing and just happen to be right, we don't think that that's knowledge, right? We don't think of that as knowledge.
This is where they talked about the mirage. The person that was walking in the desert and saw a mirage, they went towards it because they thought there was water there. There was water there.
Right.
Right?
But they actually didn't know it because
But it was truth, or it was knowledge.
Yeah, it was true. They had a belief that ended up being true, but they didn't have the right justification. Right. That's why justification is so important. So when we're talking about non-propositional self-awareness, we're talking about self-awareness that is not, I am a being, right? Like we put that as a proposition, but rather a knowledge that is just that awareness of self, right? And in that way, it's more like perceptual knowledge than conceptual knowledge, because it's not like, if you can think about conceptual knowledge is the moment at which you start to formulate it in propositions, the moment you start to put it into statements, into claims about the state of things. Then you're moving from perception to conception.
Yeah. And it happens immediately.
My knowledge that there's a house across the street exists as perceptual knowledge. When I say there's a house across the street, I'm actually making a conceptual claim.
Right.
Based on my justification is my perception of the house across the street.
What I tried to do when I read some of these chapters was to can I find the place before this is a snap? You know? Mm-hmm. It's sound, but I immediately, maybe it's because my finger's snapping it, or an airplane, I immediately place things into labels and organize things in my world immediately.
Right. And the fact is that from what we've been able to study about the psychology of perception, that's because there really isn't a distinction between conception and perception. That's why optical illusions happen, right? Because our brain is, as part of the perceptual act of composing an image for us to have in our mind, engaging in conceptual
pattern recognition.
Right. Exactly.
Because we are pattern recognizing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's part of what we do.
And when we look at something, even when I look across the street at the house, I think I have an image of what I'm seeing, but it's not. I actually take in a few key distinct traits.
Yeah, the windows,
and then compose the image for myself, because if I were going to compose an image of what I see beyond that window in the way a camera does, that would exhaust my cognitive resources. Right, our brains, if we're looking at through the perspective of evolutionary psychology, for better or worse, the notion here is that our brains are developed to be very efficient perceivers of the world.
Yeah,
and that efficiency, meaning to get the best conception of the world that we can operate in with the lowest output of calories.
So that means you're taking in as little as possible to build the structure of that house.
Right.
Because you could take a lifetime to really take in a whole house.
So our conceptual knowledge, if we're following that strain, actually develops as a way for us to take in as little information as we can get away with and still produce coherent pictures of the world that we can operate in.
Yeah.
Which may maybe that's why AIs end up being better at stuff than us sometimes.
Don't say that. So yogic perception, this is where I did good on this chapter, but this is where my notes, I fail away. I wrote soteriological.
Right.
I define that as dealing with salvation.
Exactly. That's all it means. It's a theological term for dealing with those areas of the study of theology that deal with salvation.
But my notes won't help us for yogic perception. So I'm putting them down because I don't have any notes on that one. I think I was confused by that part.
Because I think he's coming back to this focus on liberation, right?
That's where he talked about the Four Noble Truths.
Right.
And he also talked about skill, knowing how to do something versus knowing what it is. That's that apple pie versus like, I'm a baker.
Right. Buddhism is a set of techniques for achieving liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like on the most basic level, if you look at the Eightfold Path, which is, the Fourth Noble Truth, which is the means of liberation.
Right.
Right? What are the Four Noble Truths? Life sucks.
You know what? This is just... I don't like someone that does that. There's 4 things you need to do to release yourself from suffering and live a happy life. And on number 4, there's 8 things you need to do. And now, on number 8, they're going to be like, there's actually 16 things you need to do.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, it's a fractal.
Right. Well, and I think, because it's describing a technical process. It's the same like, all right, to bake a cake, you got to take these 5 steps, and in this step,
but
you got to take...
each step, you break those down into steps.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, I digress there.
No, and I think it's good. Well, part of the way I think about it is like, what does Buddhism exist as? What is it? It is the Dharma, right? It's the set of teachings, and they are teachings in what initially is an oral tradition of teaching. And so it's all organized into these lists that are easy to memorize and walk people through. Yeah. Right? That's how we do, like if you go to any like business school, it's just a bunch of like the 5 principles of good management. They're just lists of things I can tell you about to produce the kinds of results we're trying to produce.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a digression too. I think what he's talking about is this knowledge how. Like Buddhism is a knowledge how.
Knowledge how.
But what is it a knowledge of? It's a knowledge of what to do, like of a knowledge how. Like what is that how? That how is how to get to yogic perception. How to get to
know self.
A recognition of the fundamental nature of reality, because there is a notion in Buddhism that if you have that recognition, it leads to liberation. Right? And the big debates within Buddhism are like, do you have to follow the path step by step? Is there gradual enlightenment and you just kind of move up and up and up and eventually get liberated? Or is there some discrete moment of recognition that if you get it, no matter how you got there, you're liberated?
Kind of like a hole-in-one. If you hit that, you can keep trying to play golf, but once you hit that hole-in-one, you're enlightened.
Right. And that's a big debate within Buddhism, right? If you look at Zen Buddhism, the 2 major schools of Zen Buddhism break on that point, right? And it has like, do you get there by contemplating these riddles like koans, or do you get there through good sitting meditation every day, putting in the labor?
I went and saw Zen. I went to the Austin Zen Center
recently.
Yeah. How
was it?
For the first time since COVID.
Yeah. Was it good to be back?
It was. Yeah. It was. Yeah, I don't know. It was an experience. There was less percussionists. I went during the week, not the kind of weekend service tends to be bigger, but yeah, I don't want to digress. I just thinking about that. There's something I really love about Zen Buddhism, about the percussions and the chants and I don't know what the heck they're saying. I like saying it.
Yeah, when my students go to the Zen Center, because I used to have them do, in my Intro to Comparative Religion class, an exercise where I was just like, go to some religious service that is not something you're familiar with.
Right.
Right? And then I have them document that experience and write about it and do some analysis on it.
Yeah.
It's a good assignment. I should come back to it, but they would go to the Zen Center and they would often be like, because they'd have ideas of it. They're like, I didn't expect so much ritual.
Yeah. Well, I used to go there, well, not frequently, but I've explored contemplative practice communities in Austin, a bunch of them, and it was one of them. And it seemed like with every ritual is an invitation back to the present moment,
Right.
back to being here now. Give your attention to this. This is the raisin meditation. This is eating a raisin for, with all of your attention, all of your focus on this experience, on this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think Jonathan Z. Smith, who's one of the late 20th century great minds in the academic study of religion, he, in his, I think it's in To Take Place, is the book where he says this. He says, ritual is a way of paying attention.
Yeah. 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 Back to what you were saying about whether or not it's a hole-in-one. That's what I said.
Right.
Or, you do all these steps and then you attain it. Is that akin to the story they said about, the Dharma, or that you carry it as a raft? It's like a raft in a river and in the lake. Once you get to the shore, you don't carry that raft on your back. You leave it there and you walk without it.
Yeah, no, and I think
is that what they were talking about?
I think so, and I think that actually clarifies for me better what they're getting at, because I think it's not a debate about whether you need whether that awareness is in the whole, because it does seem like in Buddhism there is this moment of awareness.
Yeah,
right? There is this moment of
awakening,
awakening,
the Buddha awakening.
Right. There's the Buddha in his life, even all his previous incarnations in the Jataka tales, that he's not awakened yet.
Yeah.
And then he's awakened, right? There's a moment.
And you don't need the raft anymore. You don't need the dogma. Right. You don't need the...
Right. And so I think that sudden versus gradual enlightenment is like, how important is that raft, right? And so gradual enlightenment, people say, no, this raft is what's going to get you there. And sudden enlightenment people are like, well, if you have it, there could be any number of rafts that get you there.
Yeah.
Right? And some will do it faster than others, and part of that has to do with who you are, or that's
on what kind of experiences you have.
Right. And
we got a couple minutes left, and I want to invite you into exploration, a brief exploration of how much time we got. We
got 7 minutes.
Awesome. I want to do a Phil's at philosophy theme song. Well, we're gonna have a handful of these. It's gonna be a series.
Right.
I'm a musician. You know that. Are you a musician?
I used to play a banjo.
You used to play a banjo.
I used to play banjo.
Do you sing? Well,
badly.
I
mean, it's
how
good
you answer
when you have
questions.
a banjo. Is
oh my God.
It's easy to sing badly. It's like part of the banjo shtick, right?
Yeah. The reason I'm asking you these questions is because there'd be an invitation for you to participate in this Phails at philosophy theme song if you wanted to be. But what kind of words, like from an improv perspective, how do you want to influence this philosophy theme song?
Man, that's heavy. Like, this is going to be the theme song. I feel a lot of pressure to get it right.
Well, it's Phails, okay? I mean, if you get it right, we get this show wrong.
True. But if I get it wrong, then do we get the show right or wrong in the wrong way?
Well, what's the cash value?
I mean, is it possible to fail in the right way and then fail in the wrong way?
Well, yeah.
And there's productive failure, and then there's just being
fail in a way that's funny, I imagine. We want to fail. Well, when I think of failure, I think of failing forward, failing fast, failing upward.
You want to fail in the right way.
We want to fail in the right way.
So you want to fail, but not really fail.
I want to. Well,
you're like, I want to be free to fail.
I don't want to,
but I actually want to get to the right place.
For some reason, this came to mind, and I don't know why. But if I don't want to say the N word in this theme song, that'd be a way to fail in the wrong way.
Right? That would be one
way to fail in the wrong way. So I want it to be. I want to fail in the right way. What do you think? How would you endow a Phil Fails at Philosophy theme song.
Like, what do you want from me?
What do you want from me? Okay, what else?
I mean, it sounds like you want to be wrong in the right way.
Wrong in the right way. Right. It sounds like I have to put.
Right.
That's experience.
Wrong in the right way.
Ooh, yeah, wrong in the right way. The right way.
We could put lots of words like experience.
Yeah, well, sounds like was like experience.
Perception. Conception.
Looking up words in the dictionary.
Looking up words. Too much time on Wikipedia.
Oh my God. Perception. I actually thought about how I could get out of the house and get out of the computer as I learned these philosophy things. I did that. I've talked about this in other interviews. This Malcolm Gladwell masterclass that I watched where he was like, when you're running down something, when you're wanting to know more about a topic, get out of the computer, get out of your house, put on your clothes, go to the courthouse, go to the place where it happened, experience the location where it happened, talk to someone that saw it, or maybe someone that's the kid of someone that saw it. Like, let your mind get out there in the world and experience it. And I thought about how I could do that with philosophy.
You're doing it, man.
I guess going to the Zen Center is doing it.
But sitting here and talking, I mean...
Sitting talking to you is doing it. We talked in the original interview about, like, how does one philosophize. I think I'm doing it.
Yeah. You're doing it, man.
All right. Well,
I'm doing it. There's got to be a line there.
I'm doing it. All right. Well, this is Phil Fails at Philosophy with Grant Potts. We've been talking about the second big question. Hold up that book again. The second big question of philosophy. This is from Philosophy's Big Questions. The second big question was, what is knowledge? What's our third chapter? What's
That's
our next
what I'm looking at.
Big question?
Does reality have a ground?
Does reality? Y'all stay on this.
That's going to be fun. Seat. Yeah. Does reality have a ground?
Does reality have a ground? Is what we'll talk about next. Yeah. I want a hug, dude.
All right.
Can we end this with a hug?
I suppose so. We're going to have to move the microphones, though.
We got this one orchestrated. All right. Boom. Thanks, bro. Thanks.